Hi, welcome to the closing keynote roundtable of the Fictions of History conference. We hope you've enjoyed the conference so far. We've had a really good 2 days. We had a great keynote last night with Stephen Greenblatt. We had 20 panels over the course of this conference on a wide array of topics from presenters from all over the world. And we want to thank you all for coming and for participating and making this conference a possibility. And now we're delighted to introduce a keynote roundtable with Mark Anderson, Daniel Kehlmann, Judith Ryan, and moderated by André Acian. The title of the roundtable is Art, Fiction, and History, the work of W.G. Sebald. I want to just say thank you to the many people who made this conference possible, my fellow core organizers, Jin Chang and Sarah Salmon, as well as our many co-sponsors, Constance Old, who is generously helping us in memory of her brother Lloyd, and the conference volunteers who are been helping throughout the day, Michelle Chinitz, Iori Muscardi, Anna Kiki, Monica Zalestra, Maria Cristina Necula, Joe Goodale, and Nea Rivera. Without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to André Acian.
Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you here, and it's always a pleasure to see so many people interested in the work of Sebald. When we initially thought of doing this, we thought, well, maybe, 5 to 10 people will show up. So we're very happy to see such a big number of people. And I have to say a few things. I'm really happy that I've got this particular committee sitting in front of you today. I met Sebald a couple of times, and I have to give you some background, because when he first published The Emigrants, I read the book right away through a series of coincidences that are in fact, Sebaldian in nature. But it was a coincidence, and I read the book, and I loved it. I truly loved it. And I immediately reviewed it. And then there was a silence of a few years, and then he came up with another book, and I received the galleys of that book, and I said, oh, yummy, great. And it was The Rings of Saturn. And I read it once, and then again the second time, and I decided I hated it. I hated it, and I reviewed it for the New York Review of Books in a long piece, and I was mortified because I said something that I probably was right, but it felt very wrong. I said that this is an author who's extremely, extremely talented, but who has not discovered his form yet. Well, wrong I was, because he was writing in his form, in the form that has made him so lovable. And then Austerlitz came out, and he contacted me, and he said he wanted me to introduce him at the 92nd Street Y. I said, does he realize that I am the one who panned his book in the New York Review? And he says, yes, he knows that. That's why, or that's, regardless of the fact, that's why he wants you to introduce him. And so I met him the first time there, and he was absolutely charming. Totally charming. And I learned a big lesson at that time, is that if somebody does a nasty to you, pretend it never happened. And he pretended so well that I was almost fooled, and I realized that the tactful thing would be not to bring it up. And so we met a couple more times, and that was it, because then he died. I loved Austerlitz. I think Austerlitz is a great novel. It's an outgrowth of The Emigrants, I thought, but it has enough of The Rings of Saturn and of the other books he wrote that makes him a full novel that is indeed the perfect form of the novel as we know it. And I was thinking today of what to say, because I'm not going to be saying much after this, but I was thinking of all those great books that have been suddenly sort of crossed our firmament recently. European books, Elena Ferrante for one, Knausgaard another one, and now there's a latest manifestation of a gentleman called Edouard Louis from France, whom we've all probably seen in the New Yorker this week. They're all good writers, they're decent. But they don't have this thing that Sebald had. And that's what I wanted to say, is that there is something about Sebald that is fundamentally serious. The tone is high, the style is perfect. There is the fact is that when I was asked by the New York Magazine, what are the great novels of the 20th century, I said, the one that will remain in the next 50 years as a classic is Austerlitz. And I believe it. I think it's one of the greatest novels that we have produced, greater than probably anything else since the Memoirs of Hadrian. But that is all my opinion, and I'm usually wrong, as my wife says. So without further ado, I think we want to start with Daniel Kehlmann to give us a sense of what his experience of Sebald is.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I agree with what you said about the importance of Austerlitz, although I do like the Rings of Saturn very much. And I think, actually, if I would have, although I think Austerlitz might be his most important book, if I would have to pick a personal favorite, my favorite would be Rings of Saturn, I think, among his novels, his books.
Well, you and my wife will get along.
But, yeah, it's very interesting for me from the perspective of someone who grew up in Germany and in Austria then, and in the German-Austrian literary world, to look at Sebald and what he became and his standing in the world. Maybe we can talk about that later, because it's really strange that he never reached the kind of recognition in German literary world. He until today he didn't actually, but especially while he was still alive, he never got the recognition that he got elsewhere, especially in the United States of America. And it's a very funny and at the same time sad episode that he did. There's a very famous and also infamous literary competition that's actually on TV, live on TV, in German literature called Ingeborg-Bachmann-Preis. And in 1990, Sebald went to Ingeborg-Bachmann-Preis, which is a prize for emerging writers, and read a chapter from the exiles. From the emigrants. The emigrants, sorry. I will sometimes confuse the English titles of his books. I apologize in advance. And it was a disaster. They gave away 4 awards, and he got none of them. And it's so strange to look on that in retrospect. Sebald, who is one of the great writers of the century, reading at a competition of young and emerging writers, although he wasn't very young, he wasn't that young anymore at this point, and actually not getting any recognition. And a while, not too long after that, the Literaturhaus, the House of Literature in Stuttgart, was opened, and the head of that house, of that how do you call? Is there a way to translate Literaturhaus? Yeah. So he invited Sebald to give the opening. To do the opening remarks, and Sebald gave an amazing speech, which is a key part of his oeuvre. But the head of that Literaturhaus, he actually got into trouble because people asked him, why can't you get a famous writer for such an important occasion? And yeah, it's strange how the things developed, and yeah.
And if I can interrupt just for a second, we've decided to be in a conversation mode, not in a formal presentation mode. At the very time, this was not early in Sebald's career. This was in 2001, shortly before he died. To say that about Sebald, at the same time in New York, Richard Eder had written in the New York Times about Austerlitz, that with Primo Levi, Sebald was the foremost spokesman of the Holocaust, that he put a non-Jewish German into the category with Primo Levi, saying, these are the great writers who have been able to write about the Holocaust. So really at the pinnacle of, and at that time, there was no more famous author in Europe, in America, than W.G. Sebald. So a completely different reception. And even today, people dismiss Sebald as an American fascination or something that is not really central for German literature.
Which is incredible and really outrageous. So I'm not here to defend that position. I just wanted to bring that up. So don't look at me. And on a more serious note, what I find so interesting when you look at Sebald's oeuvre at the whole, as a whole oeuvre in its development, I think it was Nabokov who said, maybe I'm wrong about that, but I think it was Nabokov who said the only biography of a writer worth telling and writing down is the history and development of his style. And I think in the case of Sebald, that's even more true and more interesting than with most other writers, because he didn't start out as a literary writer. He wrote a lot of things in the position of being something else than not a literary writer, because he was a literary scholar. And if you read his essays, what is published today as his essays in chronological order, it's a very, very unusual development from a very conventional style, actually, a very rather confined, conventional, scholarly style of writing about literature, and then gradually loosening up and allowing himself to insert elements of fiction and of fictional writing, and even his first literary book, Vertigo, is kind of a book of literary fiction, but in the disguise of a book of nonfiction. And so he starts out being a writer of a very formal and special kind of nonfiction, literary scholarship, who then who inserts element of fiction, and he ends up being quite the opposite. He ends up being a great fiction writer who just in a very playful way pretends to write nonfiction. And yeah, I find that very fascinating.
And if I could pick up on André's remark that Sebald hadn't found his form, I think it is striking that Sebald, with almost every book, created a new form, even though in retrospect we can hear the Sebald sound, or we can see the preoccupation with certain themes and unify the books. But his very first book, when he finally gave up the academic mantle of the scholarly essay, which, by the way, he was always undermining in other ways, because he was not quite the academic. I think he was always playing at being the academic. But when his first real attempt at literature as an adult, because he had written a novel as a young man, was actually a long narrative poem, After Nature. It was one of the last things to be published in English translation, but that was the very first book. It was autobiographical, it was in 4 parts, but it was a poem. Then he went to the biographical essay, the writer essay, with an essay about Stendhal, about Kafka, about Casanova, but then fictionalizing them, taking them slightly past the mode of a scholarly essay or just an essay.
But in a somewhat uneasy way, or would you disagree? He's not completely at ease with what he's doing at this point in this. He's really, I think at this point he is really looking for his form.
He's finding his way. Then he writes The Emigrants, where he takes again the 4 stories, and instead of famous writers, he brings it into the realm of family history and photo albums and people he's happened to know, and even his own family. Then The Rings of Saturn, or a completely different book, and then Austerlitz. It was as if he was trying to find a different form with each book, which is quite unusual, I think. I don't know, Judith, if you have thoughts about this.
Can everyone hear me? Is this on? I just wanted to say, though, there is a sense of contingency in the creation of these books as well, because very often Sebald was trying to figure out how he could make a little bit more money and establish himself a little bit more as a writer. And what he tended to do was to send essays and articles to various reputable German language newspapers. So in the feuilletons of those, we see several of the stories, several of the parts of the Rings of Saturn, and some of the other things he wrote. He had loosely in mind the idea. Perhaps he might be able to put them together. But it wasn't absolutely clear as he was writing them.
Well, perhaps before we move on, we might want to consider the issue, which was raised in quite a few among the panelists before, what you call the contingency, which is the incidental and such coincidental, yes. The way in which he strings or laces things together as if there was a connection between them, but I've always felt, and maybe that's why I got fed up with the Rings of Saturn, is that I always said it seemed a bit forced and adventitious to a fault, to the point where he was putting these things together as if each one was a separate entity that was now belonging in a bigger work. But then all famous writers have done that, precisely that thing of putting together things that had been published separately.
One of the things we were also talking about is, I don't know how much this interests the general audience, but it is, for a scholar like myself, interesting to see the scholarly Sebald and the writer Sebald, these two different persona. The scholar Sebald is a polemicist. He's an angry young man. He's unfair. He criticizes writers in a way that the readers and scholars of those writers feel is completely unjustified. It's really a break from what we think of when we think of Sebald as this empathetic listener. I think one of the really characteristic marks of his fiction is that he creates this unnamed German narrator who is there listening to other people's stories. And it's that willingness to listen, that empathy, which struck, I think, a really deep chord in that moment in the 90s of a lot of Holocaust memory, that here finally was a German, non-Jewish German, who could hear the stories of the survivors of that period. And it's striking that, and I don't know if, Daniel, if you have a theory about this, or Judith, why he's such an angry polemicist as a scholar. Constantly at war with people, and then when he starts writing literature, has this great understanding of all people.
And then also, if I might add to that, it's not just, he doesn't just criticize somebody for something, he really focuses on something peculiar. The two where he made most of an impact until today as a polemicist. Well, there are three things, of course. One is famously his point that German post-war literature didn't bring up the experience of being bombed, of experiencing the bombs. And then there are two writers he really attacked fiercely in his scholarly essay. One is Jurek Becker, who was maybe the most prestigious Jewish Holocaust writer of the late 80s and 90s with his book Jakob der Lügner, which he thinks is hypocritical and just bad literature. And the other one is Alfred Anders, who was one of the leading writers of Group 47, and was also a hero of the left and of you can say anti-Nazi, you can say kind of anti-Nazi literature after the fact. I as somebody who recently reread Anders, I think that's where he's most unfair actually, but that might be, somebody else might disagree with that.
Actually, I think you're right to say he's really, or both of you mentioned that he was a product of the 1968 student movement. And I experienced bits and pieces of that when I was doing study in Münster in Germany. And there, students were marching against their professors because the professors were thought to be starchy. The professors were thought to be thinking about aesthetic matters. They were not thinking about the world or about how the world could be improved by the right kind of literature. And so, for example, they would be marching through the streets and saying, such and such professor, they would put his name in, is saving Kafka. Because at that point they thought Kafka was far too aestheticist. We would never say that today. I mean, of course, you've written the most fascinating book, though, on Kafka's early aestheticism. But that's the result of another phase. And the anger that everybody had about that, the anger at their professors and at traditional German studies. And I think that Sebald just got to the point where he thought, things have to have the right view, and the right view is my view, and if they don't have that view, then I'm going to give them a really hard time.
But it's
and
still strange. I mean, how do we put them in the right relation? The Sebald, the very, very calm, quiet, empathetic Sebald persona of the famous books, and the very, very angry scholar who basically hates everyone. They are obviously the same person, but it is very, I don't have a good theory here. I just find it very puzzling.
And it's even stranger when one thinks that some of the people he attacks, the writers, are Jewish writers. I mean, Jurek Becker is the, with Jacob the Liar, but also Brunstein's children, had written these great books about Jewish identity as a German-speaking and German-writing Jew, but also Hermann Broch. He accused Hermann Broch, this great writer, The Death of Virgil, The Sleepwalkers, who was in exile in America, working in this library. He accused him of having written a Nazi novel, of glorifying the Nazi movement implicitly with his Mountain novel. He did the same thing with, when he wrote his dissertation, a writer not that well known here named Sternheim, who was a Jewish writer of Kafka's period, who had been hounded into exile in the 30s, had suffered terribly, and Sebald accused him also of being anti-Semitic. And he sent his manuscript to Adorno, and Adorno wrote back to him and said, "You're being really tough on this poor Sternheim." So it's really quite a puzzle. I don't know what quite to make of it, and if later we'll have a Q&A period, if people have ideas about this, I'd be curious.
Well, the only thing I can say is that he was very insecure as an academician. In the academy, he was not secure. And I saw some letters, and he's always complaining about it. Even this is when he's in East Anglia. They're giving him all kinds of honorific titles. They're giving him free time. And he's always complaining, they're not giving me enough. There's not enough money. I should be doing this. I should be given that, but I'm not getting it because of such and such. You have a man who's very insecure in the profession as a professor.
Well, I think he was also angry because he felt that his family and the place in South Germany, right on the border where he was living, was not actually talking about the Holocaust, and that they had kept it from him. He felt that they were withholding information, and that was a result of their guilt or something. Yeah. But he was just angry because he felt that that should have been an open discussion in the family. Yeah. Of course, other people at the same time were saying, we're talking about this too much.
Well, later on, I think, but you're absolutely right that that is the anger that links Sebald to his generation. Young Germans born during the war, right after the war, who grew up in this, what Sebald calls the conspiracy of silence of the 1950s, where the teachers, the parents, the politicians all knew what had taken place, but didn't talk about it. And then the students came of age in the 60s, the Auschwitz trials took place, There were long descriptions in the daily newspapers about exactly what happened. And for the first time, Sebald and many of his peers read these accounts, and that, of course, is then the great anger that in the German situation, 68 isn't just the rebellion against authority that we know from this country or that the French had in many other places, but in Germany, it's fueled by that conspiracy of silence, of having been lied to by the authority figures. And I think that that's something that, you know, Sebald is really a character, his generation, that generational experience of being a second generation German is really central to his work. And that includes leaving Germany, going somewhere else, feeling like you need to be a good European because nobody knows what it means to be a good German anymore. And at that time, it seemed a contradiction in terms. And so Sebald's obscure life as a Germanist, as a scholar of German literature in East Anglia, not even Cambridge or Oxford or London, but in a provincial English university, was somehow characteristic of so many Germans who felt that, the best Germans often, that they had to leave Germany in order to be true to another identity.
Yeah, he makes that connection quite explicit in one of his last published texts, speech he gave when he was introduced into the Akademie für Sprache und Dichtung in Darmstadt. And I think this is one of his the most important texts where he talks about himself, that which he doesn't do a lot. And it's very short. It's only 1.5, maybe 2 pages. And there he says explicitly that he grew up in this unbearable silence, and especially he makes that connection that then he had to leave because that silence was unbearable. And this is extremely interesting in different ways. I think it is one of his most important experiences and formative experiences as a writer, to really feel the unbearableness of that silence about what at school, in the family, everywhere, about what just had happened when he was young. But then also he explicitly makes that connection that the silence of the things that drove people into exile actually drove him into exile. So that's the most peculiar thing about him, that he becomes one of the exiles in his own mind, whose fate is so interesting and so important and so moving to him. So he feels like he is one of them, I think.
Although, of course, he was criticized by some who said he shouldn't be identifying with these exiles. He didn't have to leave. He was never persecuted, and so forth. There's a discussion, although I think it's one of the reasons he chose for his book not the exiles, but the emigrants, yes, because he does include his own family history in that book. But he doesn't take that category of the Jewish exile or the
and the German title, Die Ausgewanderten, is even more restrained, because Ausgewanderten, it really just means those who move away. It doesn't mean refugees.
No, it doesn't, except that it is an allusion to Goethe's story about people who have left for elsewhere and actually
after the French Revolution.
After the French Revolution, and they're telling each other stories. And all of this also has to do with weaving and weavers and so forth. But one of the other things I wanted to say was that when we contrast the Sebald, the calm, cool, or not really calm, warm, but steady, slow voice of the narrator in his prose fictions, we don't have to just contrast that with the early Sebald, who was an angry young man. We can also contrast that with the transgressive writer that Sebald was. And one of the things I want to do, if we get a moment, is to show how very different Sebald as an author is from his narratives. And that was one thing I would like to just point out to us, because over and over again in his own notes, he's very conscious of this. And he writes, narrator, narr, else, does this and goes there, and so on. So he, even though many people talk about the pseudo-Sebald, just as we talk about the pseudo-Marcel in Proust, there is perhaps a more precise difference at certain moments. And I don't know if I could show that.
Do you want
Should I show that now?
Yeah, you could show that.
Yes,
sure.
why don't I see if I can do that? I have a number of slides here. So I'm not even going to show my first page, and I'm only going to pick out a couple of these images. These are, of course, not history paintings. They're views by Ruysdael of Haarlem from the 17th century. He did about 7 of these different paintings, and here we have one on the right with the warm palette and the very sunny bleaching fields reflecting the sun upward, a warm yellow color, and then a much bleaker one when everything looks much more blue and gray. And the set of 6 or 7 paintings is distributed among these 2. The one here on the right is the one that the narrator goes to see in The Hague at the Mauritshuis, and he arrives there. He's made a special trip, and he gets there. He hasn't made a trip to see this painting. He's made a trip to see Dr. Tulp's anatomy lesson of 1632, and he's so angry about that painting. Unbelievably angry. Everything's just a mishmash, things put together. The faces of the other doctors are all looking in different directions, and in any case, it's a really revolting subject. So we have a narrator here who is grumpy. He's so grumpy he can hardly contain himself. And after a while, he says, I'm going to just look at another painting. And he knows where he's going, and he's going to that one on the right-hand side. And I'm showing that because this is called the bird's eye view. Both of these paintings are in the bird's eye view. Of course, in film, the bird's eye view today also includes the aerial shot. But in these earlier centuries, it's pretty much literally a bird. And no bird has a sort of eye in its underbelly as it's flying over something. So it's always seen from an angle. These things here are actually the roofs of houses. These are the bleaching fields and the people working in them. So the point I'm making is a grumpy narrator with a very particular set of characteristics. He goes to see the Battle of Waterloo, which I think John Knight mentioned in his talk. And this is an important experience for this grumpy narrator. So off he goes. He hates Belgium, obviously. He hates Brussels. He hates Waterloo, and so forth. He goes to look at this monument. The monument, the monument is a mound, and the viewers, visitors to the battle site, go and look. They climb up the stairs. You can see them climbing up, and they walk around a sort of balcony, and of course they then have a bird's eye view of the battlefield. Apocryphally, I hear, Victor Hugo in Les Miserables actually quotes Wellington, who went 2 years after the Battle of Waterloo, and he said, they've changed my battlefield, because this mound wasn't there at all. And actually, that image is the construction of the mound made out of debris, the debris of history, debris of battle, and a small farmhouse as well. But let me go back. So here we are beneath the lion's paws. It's even more intimidating, as it were, than if you were a bird up there looking down. So When you're up high, you can have a peaceful, calm overview of everything from an angle, however. The Waterloo panorama, and I think it was Jonathan who mentioned that one today. This viewing platform, well, look at that. Look at these people on the platform. Where are they? They're up off the ground on a viewing platform. So they, in fact, have the privilege of a bird's eye view, and what they're viewing is a huge surround picture. It's a panorama that goes all around them. But what they're viewing is from a bird's eye view. They mainly look down, slantwise, and they can also see the upper parts. But everybody says, oh, it's in the center of things. But if you're in the center of things, you would be a dead body on the ground here. This is the actual painting by Duan Town in 1912. And here we see very clearly what we see of dead soldiers, dying horses. We also see smoke coming up from the fire. And the top of the picture, the horizon and the sky, is one of those bird's eye view images, just as we saw in the Roy style. Sebald was a trickster, and he took a colored brochure and he cut part of that painting out into an oval shape. I think he probably Xeroxed it on his department Xerox machine before then, making it into an oval. What point of view is that? It's not even a camera's eye. It's just kind of quaint, oldie-fashionedy perspective. I'm going to come quickly to a real history painting, Willem van der Velde the Younger, The Burning of the Royal James, Battle of Salt Bay. And you can see that here the painter also is standing at an imaginary point somewhat above the horizon. You see there's a very low horizon here. But actually that wasn't the case, because Van der Velde the Younger and the Older were both in little boats on the periphery of the scene and looking slantwise upward. But it's always peripheral and looking at an angle. I'm very partial to this because this is an image that Sebald doesn't reproduce, but his grumpy narrator tells us it's so horrible. He's been looking at these paintings in the Greenwich Museum at the observatory in Greenwich. Greenwich Mean Time, you know, it's all very steady and all very central. And it's an observatory. But he says, what's wrong with all these paintings is that they don't show what it's like for a sailor, for a fighting sailor to be standing on the deck and experiencing the boat collapsing around him as a result of fire from cannonballs from the other side. Both of the Van der Veldes first worked for Holland and then they worked for England. Here's something that Sebald didn't see, and it is an almost proto-film. We see these frigates. These are not small boats. They only look small here because he's making a quick sketch from his little boat at an angle on the side. But you can see the boat, the masts are coming down. So the reproach that the grumpy narrator makes is not really a fair reproach at all. It's just him expressing his own irritation at all this. This is more composed. It's a design for tapestry, and the little boat in the, where are we? There. In the left-hand foreground is supposed to be a representation of the boat that the artists used. But isn't that bizarre too? Because you can't draw yourself on a boat. They did. They have several pictures of themselves. But you see the peripheral position. Now what I'm talking about, and I think we can just turn all this off. So basically, the point of this is to show how the peripheral position is so important for him. And we're talking about the advantages of it. He's away in England, where he can be nice and grumpy about his parents in Germany and his teachers in Germany. He's off to the side. But then he's at the University of East Anglia. He's not at Oxford or Cambridge. So he's off to the side. How is he going to establish his scholarly credentials? Well, he makes a book of essays. And that counts as the second big long book that you have to present. So that was basically, the question is, his skepticism about whether we can even find out the truth is reflected here. His narrator has a chance to think about, first of all, the slantwise view from above, and secondly, the peripheral slantwise view up, the more subjectivized and perhaps more traumatic view, but he doesn't really learn any clear lesson. So that's just a visual interlude.
Actually, I thought that you were going to address his use of images in his literature. I think it's easy to forget how new Sebald's books felt at the time. Now we're used to people writing fiction but using these documentary images.
Well,
the seamless kind of mixing of image and text has become a real
and
cliche.
everyone got it from him. It's
And-
really...
and-
Well, the Sol Bay image is actually from Greenwich, and that's what he saw there. One thing we have is we don't have his folders anymore quite in the shape that they were, and that's for archival reasons. But when I first looked at those folders, he had cut out lots more black and white images of paintings from an art book or a catalog.
But I mean, I think the question of, for Sebald, he said that the way he wrote his books was to take images that he'd been collecting and put them out on the table and start rearranging them, and then through those seeing lines of connection between those images, then start to imagine the stories that could be told. And we take it for granted now, but it really felt revolutionary, even though, of course, images and text had been used together in many ways by many people before him, but somehow there was something new about how he did it that really struck a nerve. And I'd be curious, Daniel, if you had thoughts about what it was, of how he did it, that made it seem so new.
Well, one thing, but I have a question that just came to my mind. All those years of reading Sebald, I never asked myself the question. I'm going to ask you now because, well, I think what's really interesting and kind of new and innovative about his use of pictures is that they're not good pictures. The quality is terrible. You don't really see what's on them. You don't really know why they're in there. And of course, when you're the first one who does that, it's really confusing, and it's like there is some mystery hidden there that you need to solve. But from today's perspective, looking back on those books as they're the classics they are now, I'm asking myself, would we read them different if he hadn't put in those pictures? I think we wouldn't really miss them so much, but maybe half the room will hate me for this.
But we do also have to know that these seemingly deteriorating and deteriorated pictures are very largely made to be that. Yeah. And there have been some very interesting studies on this, and you can see that sometimes a truly hopeless, old, departmental photocopier can have its benefits because it is so grainy that you look, he makes perfectly clean, modern postcards look like something gritty, although I think he also strews some stuff on the glove.
But from today's perspective,
he's fabricating these things.
Apart from the fact, what they have become now is they have become a Sebalds signifier. We look at that and we see this is a Sebald book, or this is a book of somebody who was influenced by Sebald. But would the books be a lot different without those images? I'm asking. I don't have an answer.
No, absolutely. I mean, for me, I can't. Sebald without the images is not Sebald. I mean, they're really central, and it's. I mean, one of the things that's striking about the quality of the images is poor. He uses black and white. He gets rid of the color. That's very important of taking it out of this modern realm of contemporary photography and making it seem like an older period, even if it's contemporary. But he also, the photos were never simply illustrations of what he was saying. There were no captions. And most oddly, there was no attribution. At the end of the book, there were no rights given for images that he had taken often from somebody else. Oh, he does give the...
Yes, but he got sued.
He got sued. But the first editions of Sebald's books in German had absolutely no attributions for these images. So they seemed to come out of nowhere, and I think that was part of the mystery.
You were not actually meant to make an association between the text and the photographs, and no matter how much you tried, there was always a gap. You weren't sure if you had... Plus, we also read somewhere that whenever there's handwriting, and I might say a little episode about his handwriting. I mean, he faked the handwriting. In other words, it was just gribouillage, and it was not supposed to be read because you couldn't read it. But I have to say the story because I should have brought it with me, but I didn't. After I had reviewed his Emigrants, he sent me a card to thank me, which is nice. But he sent me an antique image of Alexandria, Egypt, where I'm from. And it was dated back to 1904. And so I get this in an envelope. It's a 1904 image of Alexandria. And in the back, there's an old lady sort of writing to her niece saying, we're having a terrific time in Egypt, and it's dated 1904. Except that on top of that handwriting, I mean, you want to use that horrible word, palimpsest, go ahead. Sebald says, Dear André, thank you very much for the review. But he's writing in black ink. And so the other thing is written in this kind of sepia ink. So it is a typical thing that he does. It was meant to thank me and to confuse me and to gratify me and to say, now you can never throw that card out because it's from me. So, but there was always a sense of the images were sometimes false. And we have another story to tell you. If you look at the image that we have for the event, this is the one, yes. We took this from the cover of the book. Yeah. And ironically, I had read somewhere, and if one of you knows, or if anybody in this panel knows, he said somewhere, because I read it somewhere, that he found this image by pure chance and simply decided that this was going to be the boy. Except there was absolutely no way, I could not find that quote again. And so in order to use this image, we had to get in touch with, what is it, who published it? Random House published the book. Random House had no idea who owned the rights to the picture, so we went to the agent. And the agent had, of course, said, go to the publisher. We went to the publisher in England, then in Germany, and they had no idea who owned it. Eventually, the agent just simply said, well, just give us $60. Which is what we did.
You know, this is also true, though, of vast amounts of the prose in these books. Vast amounts of it. He's a master at every form of intertextuality, including, of course, intermediality, but intertextuality, alluding to works, quoting snippets of works. This is the thing where he comes out of the operation and he feels as if he's in a hot air balloon up above with a bird's-eye perspective, and he uses phrases and words from Stifter. There are long passages that he translates into German from other languages. He's a very fluent translator. He founded and became the head of a translation center. But we see him in his manuscripts sort of testing these things out. He translates quite accurately, very quickly. And then he goes faster and faster to get the sentence rhythm right. But there are a lot of things where he has not made any change whatsoever. But he's very transgressive about all that, and there are some things where basically you have to ask a question. Is it still a literary borrowing if it's been translated into another language? You know, in other words, where does plagiarism stop? Or where does plagiarism start? So take a long English text, which I just worked on recently and published an article about it, an old guidebook, and he just translates it into German, and nobody knows what it is, but I discovered what it is. And I think that's why he broke with his first translator, wasn't it? Because that translator could find the passages that were directly lifted from Conrad, and he could put those back in English. But the passages from obscure books, which often go over many pages, he didn't know where to find. So that is another, so that's when I say Sebald was a very transgressive writer and very prone to appropriate things in a very creative way. He's asking question after question about what we do when we think about writing and literature and the use of material from elsewhere. So it's very fascinating.
Should we open it up
Yes.
to questions? We should, thank you all. We should open up this to questions and answers. Questions from you, answers from us. And you can ask any question you want, provided it's not a disquisition. Yes.
Maybe we should give people
You want
microphones.
Yes.
Should we give-
Thank you.
Here, what I can do is maybe take one from each table, and then we have somebody stand. Okay, questions?
Can you hear me? I have two quick questions. One is about translation and whether you think why he had his books translated, since he was such a good translator himself. Also, whether the translations are what account for his popularity abroad. And we've been talking a lot about him as an author, but the way many of us have familiarized ourselves with his work is through the translation, not directly. And so what impact the translation has, and also how much Google has changed the way we read his books, because when you're reading them now, at least I immediately Google the place that he's writing about. So when he's talking about the train station in Brussels, you can Google that and see what it really looks like compared to his, and all of the places that he writes about, you can actually see now on your computer. You don't need to rely on his descriptions, and whether that changes the way you read him, that you can just look up the place and see what it really looks like.
Well, when I refer to translation, I'm referring to the texts that Sebald read in a different language other than German. All of these big prose books were written originally and published originally in German. But in order to follow Chateaubriand, in order to follow Henri Bale, Stendhal, he just simply takes the French and he writes it out into German. And he stops here and there and interpolates comments and so forth, or he makes changes. So that's what I mean by that translation. Then we have the German books, and they were then translated into English. And when it's clear that Sebald was looking simultaneously at, let us say, Conrad's Heart of Darkness, then the person who translated this prose fiction of Sebald into English, that was Michael Hulse. And he could just take out his edition of Conrad and find the English and plug the English straight in. Because essentially what Sebald had done was take the English and put it in German, plug it into his German text. But then there were these obscure things like the walking tour logbook, that nobody knew about. And so Hals could not find where those things were. And that is not necessarily continuous pages of translation, but it comes very thick and fast in fairly large doses. And so that was why then Anthea Bell was the person who was asked to do the translation of Austerlitz, for example. Because Sebald really, and you came to Harvard too and looked at those incredible typescripts that Hals did, and Sebald's handwriting in pen off the top of it. I mean, it would take you a lot of work to go through every word of that.
Except that Michael Hals, to justify him, is a poet in his own right. And he's a poet, and he's a very good poet, actually very talented. Anthea Bell is a woman who's now translating all the works of Stefan Zweig, and she's not a poet.
Oh, I'm not criticizing.
No. I'm just saying that basically Hals said, I think it is, and to answer your question, I think, and I may be wrong, that there is something about the English, the very quality of the English prose that we have come to know as Sebald's prose, that is absolutely sublime. And I think that it started with Michael Hals, because as soon as you read Michael Hals, you can sense there's a cadence to this prose that is unlike anything we've seen in English in years. And I think that Anthea Bell does the same thing. She maintains, I'm sure she maintains Hals's rhythm and Sebald, because Sebald, of course, was a very intrusive author when it came to translation. Am I right?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, the first English translations of the Emigrants, for instance, was very much a collaboration between Hals and Sebald, because he knew English so well. Of course, with other languages, he couldn't always do that, but with his English translations, he absolutely went, and it was such a painful work for the translator to see, months of labor coming back to you with all of these markings, and you have to redo everything to make the author happy. It was a fraught collaboration, but a very successful one. But somewhat tragically, I think it foundered at a certain point, and they couldn't go on.
But tell us about the quality, because the English quality is perfect. And I'm just wondering if the German, since I don't read German.
I think the German is sublime, but I'll let Daniel answer this.
The German is sublime, but it is very different. It's not very different, but it is different. He is a different writer in German than he reads in English. And the thing that's most different is that in German, he has a real love for certain kind of local phrases or local words. Therefore, Southern German words, which he doesn't. So he sounds local in a strange way in German that he doesn't sound in English. In English, I think he reads like Borges, like this very, very worldly, extremely international writer with this beautiful flow of language. And in German, there's always this strange aspect that kind of ties him to a certain part, his prose to a certain part of Germany, where he is from. For example, he loves this word ungut, ungood, ungut. It comes up all the time, and it is I wouldn't say it's not quite dialect, but it's something that you would never find in Thomas Mann or Joseph Roth or Zweig. It is, so there is something, I wouldn't go so far to call it parochial, not at all, but there is something decisively un-urban in his, and of course he's aware of that. It's not something that happens to him, he really knows that, but there is something different to this very, very international, worldly, urban writer that he is in English.
Also the 19th century style.
Yeah.
In German you can hear the 19th century style much more clearly, and you can almost imagine somebody narrating that way.
Yeah, I think Sebald himself said that he took deliberately the sound of the 19th century to narrate the horrors of the 20th century, and that discrepancy for him was very important. But the question about Google, I think, is an interesting one, because I think it takes a lot of the mystery out of Sebald. I mean, you can instantly, you have these epigraphs, for instance, to his works. You can Google them now and you suddenly see, oh, this is from a poem by Hölderlin. Well, he doesn't tell you that. He doesn't say where these things are from, and now it's all very easy, too easy, I think, to figure out the puzzle. Other questions?
Could you please tell what other countries he is popular to, and are there translations, how popular these translations in other countries?
I don't know if there's I don't off the top of my head know into how many languages he's been translated, but I would say that that he is better loved in the English-speaking world, by which I mean America, England, Australia, New Zealand. They're very dedicated readers, but also in Italy, France, and in Spain. He's probably, I think it's fair to say, taken more seriously than he is still today in Germany. But he's probably been translated into 20 different languages, I would say, at least.
Yeah. I mean, the experience I have is that whenever I have a conversation with French critics or Italian critics, they will name a whole slew of writers that I consider either nugatory and worthless, or that I have never heard of, which is, I say the same thing about them too. But eventually, at some point when I want to put a stop to this kind of idiotic game, is to say, what about Sebald? And at that moment, every French critic, every French person, and every Italian will say, oh, well, that's serious. And so suddenly, it means that in their language, Sebald is translated in such a way that automatically he is canonical in their tradition as well.
Yeah, hi. You had raised the question of reception in Germany in the beginning, and I wonder, since Judith Ryan called Sebald a trickster, because he could have written in English, and it was apparently to the irritation of the people over in Britain that he did not write in English, because then they couldn't call him a British writer, and being the trickster, he might have deliberately also fudged his own reception, because I'm wondering if Germans were also seeing him as expatriate and British writer. And the second part of the question would be Anne Fuchs. I don't know how, but she furnished quite a bit of evidence that actually it's a myth that he was not received all that well in Germany. He won apparently a number of prizes. So I wonder if you could elaborate on that question of reception. Did he deliberately create that? Is he German or British? Did that affect the reception? And is it really true that he was received so poorly in Germany as everybody would like to think? Maybe the British created that. I don't know. That was a joke, but
no, I think it's true. I think it's true. I mean, I was there. I mean, I remember the conversation in the German literary world in the mid and late 90s, and that was the time when Sebald had already become pretty much canonical over here. I remember when Austerlitz was published, and it was really not seen as a big event. Of course, it was reviewed, but it was not seen as a big event in the German literary world. And I remember how outrageous I found it when I mentioned Sebald, that people who were part of the literary world hadn't either not even heard the name, or it wasn't considered an important writer for them at all. So it is true that he got a few awards. There was one award he got, Berliner Literaturpreis, which is a weird story in itself, because it's not a major award. And the thing that really happened, a writer who was there told me they had a couple of writers reading their, at the Literarisches Kolloquium in Wannsee, reading their work to each other. And then there was a vote, and the writers voted who among them should get the award, the Berliner Literaturpreis. There must have been mid-90s, maybe 95, 96. what happened was every single writer, including Sebald, voted for themselves. And then in the second round of voting, one writer, Norbert Gstrein, voted for Sebald. Everyone else, including Sebald, voted for himself a second time, and so Sebald got to have that award. So, so yeah, so I think unfortunately it is true that he wasn't really well regarded as well as he should have been at that point. But of course, it would have evened out. So the big the way his reputation grew over here, it would have then reflected back on how people read him in Germany, and it has, of course. But he died before that really had an effect.
I think there's a question over there. Somebody has a
Yeah.
microphone.
Yes. I was wondering about Sebald's identification as a German, to what extent he actually felt Bavarian vis-a-vis, any other of the German states. Because what struck me was when he, for example, recalled being shown Holocaust photos in school, and no one explained to him in school that couldn't really be discussed, even though they had to look at those pictures. And my experience in Germany was very different, like many decades later, or a few decades at least later. But it seems to me maybe there's something specific about his German identity, which is Bavarian, and maybe that also has to do with silence.
Well, I would say I've done quite a bit of work on Sebald's origins, and I think that he wouldn't consider himself so much Bavarian as from the Allgäu, even which is a portion of Bavaria, but it's tucked away in the corner, and it's on the border with Austria, on the border with Switzerland. He went to a high school that you could walk to Austria. It was that close. So he felt this affinity with Austria and with Switzerland, not at all with the Bundesrepublik, with the Federal Republic of Germany. But he really came out of this this rural, non-urban culture. He was born in a tiny village that didn't even have a train station, and he spoke the dialect. I've read letters that he wrote with a friend of his who went to school with. He was living in England at the time, and they're written completely in dialect. And he has these hilarious letters about sauerkraut, and written completely in dialect that, it was a part of him that you can't see in translation. There's no way that will come out. But a German ear, a sharp German ear, will hear, even in the high German that he wrote, these little inflections, and he had a very deep connection with this Allgäu region. Of course, he spent most of his life away from the Allgäu, and people ask him, well, don't you feel homesick for the Allgäu and these places? He said, yes, all the time, until I go back.
And I just want to add, those inflections you hear, he wanted that. I mean, it's not something that you can't switch off if you have the abilities of working with language someone like Sebald had. He wanted his German prose to have those inflections and to sound slightly local for a number of reasons. But and the same thing is, maybe you know more about that, when you hear him speak English, he had quite a heavy accent. And I was told by friends of his or by people who knew him that he wanted it that way. He didn't work on tuning down his accent. So he kind of liked the idea of, in a way, being a foreigner or sounding like a foreigner. Maybe that's wrong, maybe that's just hearsay, but that's what I heard.
Let me ask you a question then, and maybe I could ask you the same question. It's if he was so sort of faithful to that aspect of his background that he wanted to maintain in German, what did he do to the translators to encourage them or to discourage from them from maintaining that little inflection that would have appeared in English, which wouldn't have been that difficult to do in English with a good translator.
What do you mean by to create an inflection by
Yes,
translate?
yes.
I think it would be hard for the English language reader to perceive it. But I suppose you could do it. I just think it would sound very weird.
Well, there are ways for a translator to replicate some, and we do it all the time in cinema and television, where you have these very famous English actors speaking with a German accent when they have to, and we all take it in stride and we don't complain. But I mean, I'm just concerned that if he was so committed to maintaining this little inflection in German, why did he not labor to have something like it? Or let's say that theoretically it must have crossed his mind.
Well, I mean, the question, you know, is global English. If an English translator starts doing a Welsh accent to give this regional quality, then what is the American or the Australian reader going to do with that? If I translate Sebald and put a little bit of Bronx sound into the New York accent, I mean, it'll seem ridiculous. But I think that one of the questions that one has is, why do certain writers who are so local nonetheless translate so well into other languages? I mean, Rilke, you would say, you know, impossible to translate, but there's so many good translations of Rilke, and Rilke is so popular in so many languages. There's something about the writing. Kafka, one can say the same thing about certain writers write in such a way that even though they, in their original language, sound untranslatable. I mean, a close friend of Kafka's, Werfel, said, Kafka can't be translated. He sounds just like a suburb of Prague. How can you do that? And yet we know the history of Kafka translations. So there's some writers who can, where it doesn't matter, and I think that's one of the genius, the really tremendous aspects of Sebald's writing, is that he has that local that nonetheless seems universal.
You can hear him on CD reading his, reading from, yes, the Ausgewanderten. And in that, we hear of his arrival in England and so forth. And he uses some English words. And one can hear this particular inflection, an attempt to imitate English more Englishly than the English themselves.
I wanted to circle back to the question that you raised at the beginning, your puzzlement over the difference between Sebald, the polemical academic writer, and the hypnotic literary Sebald. And I have both a theory and a question. The theory is that he's just an effective writer, and that it's very effective within academic discourse to be polemical. There's a high payoff for that. On the psychological realm, though, we can just theorize that he was a frustrated wannabe writer, which is every other academic, unless you are André, who has actually managed to write novels. So maybe you might be able to map his criticisms of literature and see, is there a project there, a negative project that he's then trying to carry out? But my question about that is there anywhere where he has spoken or written about his transition from an academic to a novelist, his becoming as an artist, or is it something that we have to guess and deduce about from that loosening of his prose? Any clues that anyone has about that transformation? I'm really curious.
Well, to my knowledge, he said one or two things explicitly, but I don't think they're the real reason. But the reason he gave was Thatcher, that the Thatcher reforms of the university were so disheartening that he became very disgruntled with university life. You know, University of East Anglia was actually, it was provincial and it's out of the way. It wasn't Cambridge and Oxford, but it was quite a wonderful place. It was one of these new universities created on a golf course, and after '68 in the early '70s, and he was one of the first instructors there, and he had quite a wonderful time with a bunch of like-minded, very talented peer colleagues. But in the 80s, that changed, and he said himself that Thatcher made them all into pencil pushers. They had to they had to account for their work. He was very disgruntled, and that's what he gave. I don't think that's the real reason, but it's the one he gave. I think he went through a crisis in his personal life, and I'll leave it at that. It was a very difficult period, and if you read Vertigo, you see the origins. The narrator is wandering around Vienna in a daze and goes for days without speaking with anybody, and at a certain point looks down at his shoes and realizes he's like a homeless person who's been wandering the street. And he's reflecting, I think, on his writing really begins with a kind of crisis in a personal life that the writing became another world for him.
I mean, just to pick up where you asked the question, it is strange because there's a scholar, and then there's a novelist, and you use the term which was used before, the loosening of his style. You use that intentionally, I suppose. What if we, but then you said he was an affected writer, which tells us that there's maybe a problem in both terms, because in a sense I think he's a very urbane writer, and wishfully, so willfully urbane. In other words, he studied to write that way, and which makes it maybe not a loosened style at all, but a very composed one, very constructed. And I think that in many ways we can say the same thing. I mean, I hate to do this, but his identity might have been a bit constructed, since this is what we were talking about. In fact, we're not even sure. I've never quite understood what this emigration was all about. Was it that he just got a job in England and couldn't find one in Germany? Was he so dissatisfied with Germany that he was going to find something better in England, really? I mean, I don't understand what that move was all about, and why he stayed in East Anglia, which is not the best place to be, even in the 60s, though he must have been. So there's something about him that sort of always baffles us a tiny bit, and for which I don't have any explanation, and I'm not an expert in the field, so.
But it seems as if, once he finally started teaching writing, he was very gratified. He found that very satisfying. And we actually met. Do you remember the name of that person, Larry? I forgot. Wonderful young man who had been a student at Sebalds writing, in Sebalds writing courses, and he greatly appreciated Sebalds. How Sebald worked with him on his writing. This young man, by the way, had a totally different style of writing about very violent things. But clearly he had found an ideal teacher in Sebald, and Sebald really enjoyed that work.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think maybe there's one more question.
I started to read Sebald after he passed away, and I'm wondering if you can speak to whether that changed scholarship on Sebald, your relationship to his work, how your reading practice maybe changed, or maybe it didn't. I'm just wondering how his passing changed your relationship to his work, and how maybe you see the field having changed or not changed because of it.
Well, I can say that there was almost no academic work on Sebald during his lifetime. There were reviews of his work, but there was virtually no academic criticism. Now, Sebald studies have become a cottage industry. It's an enormous field of work, but that all came up after his death, and very quickly, And I don't know exactly why, but I think, I don't know, I think critics feel more comfortable when somebody's dead, right? We like dead white men. Dead writers better. You know, they can't talk back, they can't answer. Daniel?
Well, it's a big philosophical question, because the moment a writer dies, his oeuvre changes in a profound way, the way we read it, of course. I mean, now Austerlitz is obviously the crowning endpoint of that oeuvre. Whereas when it came out, it was just Sebald's new book, and it could have been a transitional novel while he was moving elsewhere. And when it's new and when the writer is still alive, that's always what you assume. You don't look at it like this is the crowning achievement. Well, it might be, but if you like the writer and if you believe in the writer, you will not say this is the crowning achievement. You will say this is his new book and there will be others. And I'm curious to see where he will go. And the moment he dies, then, of course, everything is kind of fixed into place. And you have kind of a narrative arc of that writer's development that didn't quite exist before. So, but you have that with every writer, but of course, even more so with writers who die at a moment when they might still be able to produce their best pieces of work, their best work. There's a, and you read, it's all a construction in a way. I mean, the Austrian historian and scholar, wonderfully witty person, Egon Friedel, in his Kulturgeschichte der Neuzeit, he writes about Goethe taking part at the German military campaign into France. And Goethe has a wonderful description of being shot at, what it is to come into fire at Valmy. And he describes the sound of the bullets, actually. It's a great piece of writing that actually reads like Ernst Jünger in a strange way. But anyway, Friedel takes that and he says, if Goethe had died at Valmy at this point, we would regard it as a real tragedy, but we would also say, what could he have done after Iphigenia? So the moment somebody dies, everything changes, the way we read him. And of course that happened to Sebald.
Well, maybe we should conclude here, and I should point out that Daniel has completed in the New York Public Library his latest novel, so that will not be the last word from him, we hope. Thank you very much. Thank you for attending.